From Oxford, Ohio, broadcasting just steps away from the glistening scenic campus of Miami University. You're listening to Don't Encourage This, a series of interviews and conversations on storytelling and meaning-making with creatives, artists, and interfaith voices. I am your host, Mark Von Bullock. I'm a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. In this episode, we will be exploring the parables of Jesus from two different interfaith perspectives, the Christian and Jewish faiths. The parables of Jesus have fascinated people from all walks of life for centuries. By teaching through stories, Jesus and other Jewish leaders like him invited their listeners to engage in spiritual concepts about God, life, and the human experience through the lens of imagination, storytelling, and interpretation. This edition of the program, we will be exploring one of the most famous biblical parables, the parable of the prodigal son, through two distinct interfaith interpretations. How Christians have often interpreted this beloved text over the ages, and also its uniquely Jewish roots. To help me with this special interfaith conversation, we are joined by one of the world's leading Jewish biblical scholars. My guest today is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler, Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Harvard International University for Religion and Peace, and University Professor Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She was the first Jewish scholar to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute and has had no fewer than 3 audiences with Pope Francis. She describes herself as an unorthodox member of the Orthodox Synagogue and a Yankee Jewish feminist who works to counter biblical interpretations that exclude and oppress. On top of that, she is also a very funny writer. It is my honor and privilege to welcome to the program Dr. Amy Jill Levine. Dr. Levine, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be with you. Please call me AJ.
Okay. I will certainly try. I'm a Southern boy, so old habits die hard. I will certainly do that. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time with one of the most well-known passages in all of Scripture, the parable of the prodigal son, which is found in Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 32. Of all the parables of Jesus, this is probably one of the most beloved passages for preachers to preach. Even if you've never read the Bible, most of us could probably give at least a rudimentary summary of the story from having heard it somewhere, either in a community of faith or from popular culture. Movies have been named after it. Books have been named after it. Episodes of Star Trek have been named after it. Whether you consider yourself a religious or a secular person, it has permeated our culture throughout the ages. AJ, you have written at great length about the parables of Jesus. Before we get too far into the prodigal son, I'd like to talk about parables broadly in the general sense. Why do you think Jesus liked teaching in parables so much? And what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions we have about them?
Yeah, well, we only know that Jesus taught in parables because Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke are shared sources. If you just look at the Gospel of John, you would not find parables the way we normally think of them, like extended short stories. He taught in parables because Jews understood parables. Other Jews are teaching in parables. It's not as if he invented the genre.
Yes.
Jews had known from way before, if we go back to the scriptures of Israel, the scriptures that Christians and Jews share. We've got parables there. We've got over 1,000 parables in rabbinic literature. So everybody knew within the broader Jewish world that they were an effective teaching tool. They're designed to persuade. They function even without the author having any sort of credibility. You don't need to know who the author is. The parable's still going to work.
Yeah, sure.
And they're a great way of, as the old saying goes, teasing the mind into active imagination. They make us think. And that's a very good thing for stories to do.
Yeah, and I noticed that in some of the Gospels, depending on which version we're reading, there are parables where there's a little footnote that will say, and then Jesus pulled them aside and told them what it really meant, but we don't get to hear any of that usually.
Yeah, and it's just as well because the disciples are not always the sharpest students in the seminar. So because we don't have explanations, that's an invitation to us to say, oh, well, what do we make of that? And sometimes when we do get explanations, Luke says about the parable of the widow and the judge, oh, this is designed to teach you to pray always and not lose heart. That's an okay interpretation, but I don't think that's what first century Jews are getting. When a woman comes into a courtroom day after day after day and eventually threatens to give the judge an uppercut, there's actually a Greek boxing term. I don't think that means pray always and not lose heart.
Yes.
So we can see the evangelists coming in and being, good teachers and saying, here's what I get out of it. But that doesn't restrict us from getting other meanings from it as well.
Well, and it seems to me that when you have a story that multiple people can look at together, each and every one of us is going to have a different perspective, a different background, a different context. So we're all going to see these stories from different angles, which it would seem to me would contribute to a much richer dialogue and conversation about how they might be speaking to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I suspect that Jesus told parables in part to get people talking with each other, so that he would tell a parable and, Peter would look at Andrew and say, what do you get from that? And let's go ask one of the Marys. And they're open to having a conversation. That's the way parables have functioned over time. And we've got 2,000 years worth of interpretations of these things.
Yes.
And it's not as if all Christians have agreed. Not all Christians are in lockstep.
No, certainly not. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about the story of the prodigal son. I mean, this is certainly one of my favorite parables. Many preachers and faith leaders love this parable for a variety of different reasons. And there are different angles, to use your words, that are often very popular in sermons on the prodigal son. Let me also say that I think I have fallen into some of these traps when preaching myself. So I don't want to cast the first stone as someone who lives in a glass house. But what do you think?
Hey, how many metaphors and cliches can you use in one sentence? That was impressive.
Well, thank you. Thank you. What do you think are some of the traps that Christians in particular can fall into when climbing into the pulpit on Sunday morning to pontificate on this particular parable? What are some of the interpretations that we might be wise to watch out for?
One standard Christian interpretation is that the dad in the prodigal son represents God, and that Jews would have been shocked at the idea that God would forgive a sinner, because the Jewish God in some Christian views is the angry, wrathful, icky God of the Old Testament.
Yes.
And then Jesus invents like a new and improved God. It's a misreading of the Bible. It's a misreading of Jewish tradition and it's bad theology. So that's not helpful. Or that the prodigal son represents Gentiles, as if working for a pig farmer turns you into a Presbyterian. And that would have been illegal for Jews to do. And, well, that's not the case. I mean, you do what you have to do in order to survive.
Of course.
He's taking care of the pigs. He's not eating the pork. In fact, he's not eating anything because nobody's giving him anything.
Yeah.
So it becomes a parable about Jewish xenophobia, about Jewish hatred of foreigners, and how Jesus invents universalism. That's not helpful either. Jews are welcoming Gentiles into the Jerusalem temple. Gentiles are worshiping together with Jews in local synagogues. That's not helpful. The title Prodigal Son is a crappy title because it begins, there was a man who had two sons.
Yes.
So as soon as we foreground the prodigal then becomes in the Christian imagination the forgiven Gentile, which means that the older brother becomes the unforgiven, unlikable Jew. And then, particularly in Protestant sermons, when the older brother says to the dad, listen, I've been working like a slave for all these years. Oh, that's Judaism engaged in works righteousness, thinking you have to follow all these laws and be completely obedient in order to earn God's love. Well, no. The reason Jews follow Torah is in reciprocity to God's love, because it's God who gave us the Torah out of love in the first place. So that's how you respond. So these are just ways of making Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. And the message to the congregation at the end is, well, thank God I'm not like those Jews. And that's not a really good theological takeaway.
No, not at all. And I really appreciate something that you mentioned a little earlier. Many Christians will say this, that, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is, this angry, wrathful God. And then, as you said, that, Jesus comes in and reintroduces this happy, clappy version of God. A lot of Christians read the Bible that way. And, we just had a Bible study at our church the other night where we pointed out, look, first of all, Jesus has quite a bit of fire and brimstone moments of his own. He wasn't just happy-clappy all the time. And number two, the God of the Hebrew Bible is not just anger and wrath and judgment. There's lots of beautiful mercy and peace and justice. Those ingredients are part of both testaments, it would seem to me. So I'm so glad that you identified that early on as something that we need to just brush away.
Yeah, when I get that nonsense from my students, or when people send me examples of bad sermons all the time, I have a whole collection. Pray for me. The Old Testament God of wrath versus the New Testament God of love. I say, fine. The Old Testament, to use Christian terminology, gives us the Lord is my shepherd who leads me beside still waters and restores my soul. But Jesus says, you are condemned to the outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth.
It's true.
So if I wanted to play that nasty game of dueling gods, well, Jews have a good shepherd and Christians have a sadistic dentist. And neither one is particularly helpful because it's both.
Yes. There's a line in your book that I particularly love. Psalm writes, the Lord is my shepherd, not the Lord is my sadist.
I don't remember saying that, but that is a very good line. Thank you very much. It's good for me.
I agree. Well, okay, so reading a bit from Luke 15, Jesus is teaching a series of parables that culminate in the prodigal son. And we begin with these words. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, this fellow, meaning Jesus, welcomes sinners and eats with them. Who are the Pharisees and the scribes who are apparently grumbling about Jesus? I mean, Christian preachers, I think we have this bad tendency to cast them in the role of these sort of mustache-twirling villains on Sunday morning, but I'm pretty certain that's not really what the Pharisees were actually like. What do scholars really know about the Pharisees? Who were they?
Yeah. Well, in 2019 in Rome, there was a major international conference on who are the Pharisees, which is how I got one of my audiences with the Pope, because we got a papal audience given that conference. The only Pharisee from whom we've got written records is Paul of Tarsus. So we've got descriptions of Pharisees in the New Testament, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as in Acts, and Paul's comment about his own background. We've got references probably to Pharisees in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Pharisees are referred to as seekers after smooth things. In other words, people make things too easy. They're not as rigorous as the folks out in Qumran. We've got references in Josephus, our first century historian, who's no fan of the Pharisees. Josephus, who's a priest, thinks that people ought to be listening to the priests, which in Judaism is an inherited position. Like if your father's a priest, you're a priest.
Sure.
Pharisees are lay leaders. They're members of what might be considered a voluntary association who are just out there walking the walk and talking the talk, and people are listening to them. So to use the British term, Josephus thinks they've up-jumped. They've gotten ahead of their station. And we've got references to Pharisees in rabbinic literature, so we have to quadrangulate. And as best as we can tell, first century Pharisees at the time of Jesus, are the liberalizers. They realized that certain forms of Torah obedience can be very, very strict, like from the people who are writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they're making things easier. Jesus is actually the one who takes the law and makes it tougher, right?
That's true.
The law says don't murder. Jesus says, and this is actually a Jewish thing to do, he does what's called building a fence about the law. He makes another law to make sure you don't violate the first one. He forbids being angry, because if you're not angry, you're much likely to murder.
Yeah.
The law forbids adultery. He says don't think about it, because if you don't think about it, you don't plan it. If you don't plan it, you're less likely to engage in it.
Don't think about it is a lot harder than don't actually do it.
Oh, you bet. You bet. It's a form of like mind control. Probably good idea. Like, let's get to the heart of the issue here. But it is harder to do.
Yeah.
As like love your enemies is a whole lot harder than treat them decently.
Of course.
Which is what Jews are required to do. I'm not required to love my enemies. I'm not there yet. But, one can be decent towards someone one dislikes. So they're actually the liberalizers. They're the major competition for the followers of Jesus, because Jesus, like the Pharisees, is out there among the people. And it's a question of which teaching do you want to follow? Do you want to follow one single charismatic leader who's predicting the inbreaking of the kingdom of God, which we would describe today as like the end of the world, the beginning of God's reign?
Sure.
Or do you want to follow this voluntary society where there's no like head Pharisee? It's a group of people who debate among themselves, who are saying, here's the best way that you can live out what God wants you to do. Also something Jesus is concerned about, but without that sense of the end of the world immediately breaking in. These are viable options.
I want to pull another quote from Short Stories by Jesus. This is regarding the Pharisees. We need not have negative views of the Pharisees in order to understand the parables. To the contrary, such readings reverse general Jewish views. The Pharisees were the ones respected by the people at large. Paul, as you said, the only self-identified Pharisee from whom we have written records, trots out his Pharisaic origins as something worthy of admiration. And then you added this line, although heaven forbid Paul should boast, which made me laugh. And that's in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, for those of you playing the home game.
Yeah.
So Paul was very proud to be a Pharisee. He didn't see it as something to be like, oh my God, I'm in with these like self-righteous. It's like when I have my Eagle Scout award presented in my church office. He was very proud of it.
Yeah, and he doesn't cease being a Pharisee either. It's not like he somehow converts to Christianity, a term, by the way, he does not know, or at least he does not use. And we can see in the book of Acts that he continues to trot out his Pharisaic credentials. He just thinks he's like a better Pharisee because he's a Pharisee who's got a Messiah.
This is how the gospel sort of sets up this parable of the prodigal son. I mean, here's how I have preached this parable in the past. And I think a lot of Christian preachers have preached it this way. This is a sympathetic story about a wayward younger son who undergoes a transformation, and his resentful, passive-aggressive older brother who's quietly stewing about working in the fields, and he just can't kick his workaholic habits. But more importantly, he feels no compassion for his younger brother who was lost and now is found. But that's not quite how you read this parable. You see these characters as much more nuanced and more profound in their emotional struggles. Is that fair to say?
Well, you've come up with nuance. I'm just not sure the nuance you've come up with is profound. As soon as we start attributing emotions to people, I mean, again, this is a form of reading, and all stories are open to multiple interpretations.
Sure.
I've actually found a lot of Christians who are very upset with the way the older brother is treated. And they're usually older children or only children who are responsible for everything.
Naturally.
And they kind of like at the older brother and go, I understand exactly what he's thinking. Before we move immediately to allegory and decide that the father is God and the younger brother is the restored Gentile Christian and the older brother is the pissy Pharisee, why not just look at it as a story as Jesus tells it? There was a man who had two sons. Well, what do you do when you have two kids and you have the responsible older one and the younger one who says to dad, give me the share of my property that's due to me, which is not an insult. He's not treating dad as if dad is already dead. This was actually fairly common in antiquity in both Jewish and pagan sources. Sons of very, very wealthy dads to say, give me my share now, because I know I'm not going to get the full cut. It's probably going to go to the older brother.
Yeah.
So I can go make my way in the world. And if dad thought something had gone wrong, dad could have said, listen, young man, you've just violated the fifth commandment. You're supposed to honor your dad, so go out and work in it. No, it's like dad happily divides his property between them. Younger brother takes the liquidated assets and goes off and spends it all in dissolute living, which I'm not even sure is sinful. I just think it's stupid. If you go out and you blow all your money on parties, that's not necessarily sinful. That's just dumb.
Yeah. I live in a college town, so we see this every day.
You got it. Well, I have two children, so I went through their teenage years. I understand how that works.
Yeah.
In fact, I was one myself many, many years ago. He spends all his money. Famine hits the land, so now he's got nothing, and nobody else has anything either. He hires himself out to work for a pig farmer. We actually have from Egypt the Oxyrhynchus papyrus contracts. This is a bit like temporary work, temp work, where you can hire yourself out to somebody for a certain number of days, and this is what you get in return. To get room and board, you get a certain salary, whatever. So he's doing temp work for a pig farmer. This is a big come down for a Jewish kid. And he's not getting any food, and nobody's giving him anything to eat. And then he has this aha moment where he thinks to himself, and thinking to yourself in the Bible is usually a sign of conniving. That's what, like, ancient thought bubbles is conniving. He thinks, how many of my father's hired hands have bread and enough to spare? Like, daddy's got plenty of stuff. And here I am dying of hunger. Well, I know what I will do. He says, I'm going to go to dad and I'm going to say to dad, listen, dad, I have sinned against heaven and I have sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. And in the Christian imagination, this is the big conversion moment. I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
My former colleague, David Buttrick, who taught homiletics, the art of preaching, Presbyterian, described this as, I'm going to go to daddy and sound religious.
Yes.
So whether he's converted or whether he's just being extremely practical, well, that's a judgment value.
Is this like when my sister and I were kids? I remember one Christmas, my sister and I had a staff meeting where we were discerning of this whole Santa Claus business, whether this was real or not. And we kind of had a little chit chat where we said, we're not sure. We think this might be all fake, but we should just go along with it anyway, because we don't want that gravy train to discontinue if we say we don't believe in Santa Claus. Is this sort of what you think the younger son may be doing? Like, okay, if I go to dad and I pretend to be repentant, then he'll give me this, that, and the other. Or is that sort of maybe what might be happening here?
Strikes me as a viable way of reading it. It depends upon whether you like this younger brother or not.
Yeah.
The next parable, by the way, it's really a triptych. It's lost sheep, lost coin, and two lost kids.
Yes.
The very next parable in Luke, and again, the ancient texts don't have any chapter divisions, is the parable of the dishonest steward, who is accused of squandering the master's property. And the word squandering is exactly the same term that's used for the prodigal, the accusation that he squandered your money.
We're noticing a pattern.
So there's a pattern, but does it make a difference if you squander your own money or you squander somebody else's money?
Sure.
One is sinful, the other is just stupid. So again, we can start doing the comparison. Wait a minute, is this exactly the same? Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
I don't think he actually sinned. I think he's just sounding religious because I can't figure out what exactly he did that was sinful. when the older brother is out in the field and dad finally comes out and chats with the older brother. And the older brother says to dad, he squandered your money with prostitutes. And as I put in the book, I don't think he sent home a postcard with a picture of the Whore of Babylon on it saying, having a wonderful time, wish you were here. I think this is basically distancing language where the older brother's thinking, well, parental love is a zero-sum game. So if daddy likes Junior less, daddy will like me more.
Yeah.
Well, that's very human.
It is.
I don't need a theology to understand what's going on here. All I need is some sense of how families work.
Yeah. I think many siblings struggle with that kind of angst at some point or another. Whether it's true or not, many siblings have that competitive emotion for a parent's love.
Right. Or we have the problem of the sibling, the one who sucks up all the air out of the room, whether because he's prodigal, which just means you spend all your money in not great investments. So the one who's great at math, or the one who's the fabulous athlete, or the one who falls into forms of addiction and therefore requires more concern, or the one who runs away and then comes back. And then there's the dutiful one who's doing everything exactly right. But that kid is not getting the same amount of attention.
Yes.
And when does that kid finally begin to say, you've never acknowledged me. You've never given me anything.
Yeah.
And when this guy, who's apparently done things that are not great, comes back, here's a huge celebration. And when do I get my turn?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important question for parents to think about, for kids to think about, particularly kids who resent the one who's sucking up all the air.
There's a lot of information about this family that we don't know. We don't know how the father treated both of these sons before the story begins. We're sort of left to imagine or try to look for clues hidden in the story. You mentioned something interesting, that the older brother accuses the younger brother of squandering all the money on prostitutes. I'm trying to remember. I don't believe that the text actually explicitly mentions prostitutes.
No, it just says dissolute living.
Yeah. So, I mean, it could have been. Elder is just, embellishing and really trying to lay it on thick. It makes me wonder, what was their life like? What do you make of the father in this story?
I think he's also lost. So it's not only two lost sons. I think it's also a lost dad who has more or less lost his older son. So what do we have here? First of all, there's no mother, and that's weird.
Yes.
I would have expected a mother. In fact, I could have expected a couple of mothers. And now I start worrying about, were they children of different mothers? Well, that makes a difference.
Yes, it does.
There's a little bit of the Joseph story here.
Yes.
Was the older brother, the responsible one, like Judah, the older son, and Joseph, the young twit, who says, I'm more important than you, and you're all going to bow down to me. And then he eventually leaves home and then comes back, and there's a big party. When I look at the parable in light of what Jews might have thought at the time, the parable begins, there was a man who had two sons, at which point every Jew knows the plot line.
Yeah.
Because we've got Cain and Abel and Ishmael and Isaac and Esau and Jacob and Bathsheba and David's first dead son and the second son is Solomon.
Yes.
So there are a lot of these older brother, younger brother, and everybody knows you go with the younger brother. But parables often reverse the way we tend to think about things, and that's the surprise or the persuasive element in parables, where I'm thinking I'm really going to like the younger brother, because Abel's the one whose sacrifice is accepted,
Yes.
and Isaac is the one who inherits the promise, and Jacob is the one who manages to get his family to survive, right? 12 sons. And then it turns out the younger brother's kind of a twit.
Yeah.
Give me all my stuff, and then I'm going to go out and spend it, not in decent investments or charitable giving, or setting up, food kitchens. I'm just going to go party. And I'm thinking, well, maybe I've discounted some of those older brothers. And when I go to post-biblical rabbinic literature, I find, for example, they're very sympathetic to Cain.
Yeah.
Because they blame it on, if God had accepted Cain's sacrifice, none of this mess would have happened. If God had stopped the murder or explained to Cain what murder is, because Cain doesn't know, nobody's died yet.
Yeah.
And they're sympathetic to Ishmael. And they note that when Abraham dies, Ishmael comes back home and he and Isaac together bury their father's body.
Yeah.
They've got some sympathy for Esau, and Jacob and Esau eventually reconcile. Maybe we ought to go look at some of those older brothers and retell their stories.
And that's something really provocative about a parable like this one, because it not only makes us rethink the dynamics that we think might be in place in this story, like you said, it also makes us go back and rethink other stories that we've heard and that have been told and that we've sort of become accustomed to hearing in a certain way, and think, well, wait a minute, maybe there was more going on than we assumed. And I think that's a very provocative thing for a parable to do.
I think so. Well, if Jesus is not provocative, why would anybody pay attention to him?
Yes.
To be provocative does not make you anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. It just makes you, well, stop and think and say, oh, yeah, right. Here's some stuff in my tradition that I might have ignored. Here's some stuff in my tradition that I might want to reconsider, which is what good Bible readers do when they talk to other people. Because if you just tell them stuff they've already known without any provocation, you're not going to get anywhere. You just remain at the status quo. In terms of the dad being lost, the dad welcomes the prodigal home and, bring out the robe, the best one, put a ring on his finger. So they got plenty of money. So dad's not hurting economically from having divided his material. They kill the fatted calf, the grain-fed calf. So it's like the special meal. And they begin to celebrate. So what happens? The older brother's in the field. He hears the sound of music and dancing. Okay. So they had enough time to call the band and the caterer. Everybody's chowing down at the fatted calf buffet. And older brother has no clue what's going on, because dad had 2 sons, but unlike the sheep owner who lost a sheep, and unlike the woman who lost a coin, that doesn't count.
Yeah.
So the older brother becomes angry and refuses to go in. Well, I would feel the same way.
Of course.
Right? You're throwing this huge party. I'm your only other son, and you don't bother to call me from the field? Like, hello, Dad.
It stings a bit.
Yeah, it does sting. And dad has to go out and talk to the older brother. And I think that's the moment where the older brother says, listen, all these years I've been working like a slave for you, not in the sense of works righteousness of God, but doing everything right.
Yeah.
And feeling not acknowledged. And here's Junior, who's getting the buffet.
Yeah. That's a hard pill for a parent to swallow. That's a hard thing to hear.
Yeah. Or you always loved him best, or you never cared about me. Or the dad who might have thought, well, of course I love you. But did he ever say so?
Yeah.
Did he ever demonstrate that love? Because if you just say it, but you don't do something to make the child feel loved, or the spouse feel loved, or the parent feel loved, sometimes the words become empty if they're not backed up with action.
And this is what makes relationships so complex, and also I think what makes this story so rich, particularly your reading of this story, because we've all been there at some point or another. We've all been in a situation where, despite our best intentions, a relationship has not gone the way that we hoped it would, or we thought it would, or our best intentions have not translated through our actions in the ways that we think that they do. And we hurt people even when we don't mean to. You said something a little earlier, and I think you wrote this in the book as well. We call this story the prodigal son, and we often assume that whether that refers to the younger son or the older son, that the reason they're prodigal is because they've done something wrong. They've either gone off and partied, or they lack compassion, or whatever. But what you seem to be hinting at is that what's really prodigal, what's really lost, is the relationship. That the father has lost his relationship with this older son and maybe not even realize it. And that's so painfully tragic.
Right. And perhaps has been losing it exponentially year after year after year after year. So older brother's resentment grows and grows and grows.
Yeah. And this happens all the time in parent-child relationships that become estranged, or when a divorce happens, it can often be because things have just simmered over time. And I think that's an interpretation that doesn't get heard from the pulpit on Sunday mornings very often, but I think it's very, very haunting and very powerful.
Jesus is reaching people where they are in terms of their hearts. What happens in Christianity is that the parables get yanked out of their historical context, and emphasis on the Christ himself comes to the fore.
Right.
So the whole thing then has to be about Jesus and what's Jesus' new message, and it becomes theological, or to use the technical term, Christological. It's all about the Christ and salvation. Yeah. Because of the focus on who Jesus is, we kind of lose the focus on who we are and what we need to do for ourselves.
That's well said.
The two need not be mutually exclusive. One can still have a focus on Jesus and then take the parables not only as about Jesus. If you want to make Jesus the prodigal son, that's St. Augustine, for example. I mean, you can do that, but you can do more.
Yeah, this story can help us to reflect on who Jesus is. But I think the care that we need to take is to not let that lead to this oversimplistic little moral that we wrap on the end of the story with a bow. And I do think as Christian preachers, we sometimes try to do that with these parables. But I think when we do that, well, number one, we fall into some very anti-Semitic traps. But number two, we miss out on the more uncomfortable aspects of what these parables say about our lives that probably we should be sitting with a little bit more and reflecting on, how have I lived this story out in my own life?
Yeah. And Jesus actually tells us, if we go back to Mark 4, which is the explanation of parables, these are not that easy to understand.
Yeah.
And, if you have to ask for additional explanation, when the disciples do, Jesus looks at them at one point and says, like, don't you guys get it either? Because you're looking for the simple answer rather than doing the hard work.
Yeah. That's well said. AJ, I really appreciate you mentioned historical context. You touched on this a little bit earlier. The stories of the Hebrew Bible are filled with messy, complicated family dynamics. And these can be dynamics between siblings, but they can also be between parents or spouses. I mean, you mentioned Cain and Abel. There's Abraham and Isaac, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. I mean, there's countless examples throughout the Hebrew Bible of these texts trying to explore what does it mean to be a human in all of its beauty and all of its messiness.
Right. And they're basically then invitations for us to step into that story and say, if I'm King David or I'm Esau or I'm Ishmael or I'm Hagar, what am I doing? Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
What could I have done otherwise? How do I assess this? Can I still like these people afterwards? Do I recognize in their fallibility my own fallibility? And, the theological message is if God can love these people, boy, there's hope for the rest of us.
Sure.
So we talk about like the Old Testament God of wrath. Well, after a murder, what does God do? God protects Cain.
Yeah.
After Adam and Eve screw up and they leave Eden, God goes with them.
Yeah.
It's not as if screwing up fractures the relationship.
Yeah, God doesn't just abandon us even though we're imperfect, even though we make mistakes, even though we do damage to ourselves and one another. That doesn't mean that God just leaves us.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the concerns about free will. I mean, we're stuck with it, so fine, we're going to muck up because that's what humans do. But there's always a way of getting back into the system.
Yeah. So the parable kind of comes to a close with this father and the older son having this conversation in the field, and then it just ends.
Yeah, so there's no nice, pretty bow at the end.
Yeah, there's no real moment where the older son says, "Oh, gee, thanks, Dad. I'm so glad you finally told me that. Let's get in there and celebrate." Like that, none of that happens. They just sort of lay all that stuff out there, and then Jesus says the end.
Yeah.
And I guess we're sort of left to try to make of that what we will.
Right, and that's where the hard work can actually begin. Do they go back? What happens since Dad says to the older brother, everything that's mine is yours, which is legally true because he divided his property between them.
Sure.
What's going to happen when Dad dies?
Oh, yeah.
Is there ever going to be any sort of reconciliation? Because we don't know what life is like between these. We don't know what the younger brother thinks about the older brother.
Yeah, we don't know anything.
Younger brother's, perfectly happy with his new robe and his new ring and his new sandals and his barbecue. Did he ever think to go out to the field to say, "Hi, older brother, I'm back, and I'm here"? Nothing.
Yeah, that's true. He doesn't even, so far as we know, there's no mention that he even speaks to his older brother when he gets home.
Nope.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Oh my goodness.
So what's missing?
Yeah.
And then how do we want to see this thing resolved? So the invitation to us is, okay, you write the next scene. What happens? What do they say at the table? Or maybe we just end with the idea that instead of waiting for all this repentance and forgiveness, because that's Luke. Luke sets the whole thing up in terms of repentance and forgiveness. Luke loves repentance and forgiveness and like major Lucan themes. Who needs to be forgiven and who needs to repent? Or is the issue actually sin in the first place? And then how do we define sin? Is ignoring a child sinful? Is failing to recognize somebody's feeling of loss or feeling of resentment or feeling of being ignored? Is that a sin? Is to feel ignored sinful, or is that just to be honest?
Yeah.
Does the younger brother have anything to apologize for? Because did he actually do anything wrong, or is he just using language of sin because he thinks that's going to get him back into Daddy's good graces after he left and blew everything?
Right. It could be possibly that all of the characters in this parable have some self-examination to do. There are questions that could be raised about all three of them, and that leads to questions that we can raise about ourselves.
Right. So Dad says to the older brother, look, your brother who was lost is now found. He was dead and he's now alive. So it's your brother language, bringing that family back in, as opposed to the older brother saying, your son, not my brother. Perhaps the whole thing is not about repenting and forgiving in the first place. Perhaps the whole thing is just about go to lunch. Sit next to him at the table, and maybe something good will happen.
Yeah.
And the model is families today, Christian families, where, one brother says to the mom, I'm not coming to Christmas dinner if my sister's there because I can't stand her because she did whatever 20 years ago.
Yes.
Or I'm not going to come until she says she's sorry. Well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So just come to lunch and maybe, over a glass of Christmas punch or whatever, maybe you guys can reconcile. But at least come to lunch. Give it a chance.
It's so relatable because we've all had those grudges and resentments that we've held on to over time for whatever the reason may be. But when you have that rare moment when you are able to come to lunch or sit down with that person and you're reminded that you're both human beings, sometimes, maybe not all the time, but sometimes there is this sense of, geez, why didn't we do this years ago? Like, why did I hold on to this for so long? I mean, yes, what happened, it happened, but all of the years that were wasted holding on. I mean, and there's sometimes when that's not an acceptable outcome. But there are other times when that can happen, when there can be that reattending to the relationship.
Right. The younger brother says to dad, give me my share of the inheritance. Yeah, he asked for what he wants. The older brother never asked for that goat.
Yeah.
So when do we have the courage to say, this is actually what I want. I want to share this idea with mom and dad.
Yeah, to state your needs.
Yeah, because some kids won't do that. They just expect that the parents will know, and the parents have no clue.
Yeah.
So it's not only the responsibility of dad regarding the older brother, it's also the older brother's responsibility of saying what he needs rather than sitting there and stewing, because that doesn't get you anywhere either.
Yeah, I'm going to sit here and quietly resent that you're not psychic.
Yeah.
That kind of brings me to when someone leaves the sanctuary after a worship service and like, oh my God, the preacher told me this hugely depressing story about the prodigal son, and now I got to go home and think about it. It sounds like we think about how are the ways that we tend to the relationships in our own lives? How can we be honest about what our own needs are? What are some of the ways that maybe we haven't been fully checked in with other people in our lives? And what are the ways that we can show up? Because you're exactly right. The parable of the prodigal son doesn't give us the ending, but we can write the ending in our own story.
Right. So then why would you call this a depressing story?
well, no, just after talking about all the damage that had been done to these relationships and all that stuff. But you're right. There's a little hopeful kernel.
Yeah, the parable's an invitation. I don't find it depressing at all. Because, sometimes honesty is difficult to swallow, but that doesn't necessarily make it depressing. That makes it, there's actually something I can do.
Yeah.
I'm not helpless under these circumstances. I'm not sitting here wallowing in sin. I can actually be a better me. And in that process, I can actually make the family perhaps better, but at least I'll have some encouragement to do it. That's not depressing at all. That's fabulous.
That's a good thing.
I think so. The other thing with parables is that once you think you've got it, right? So it's all about family values and whatever. It's like it turns out there's always some other iteration. After I wrote the book, I used it in a class on parables that I taught locally here. I live in Nashville at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute, where I'd been teaching up until COVID. I had been teaching there regularly. So I'd bring Vanderbilt Divinity students out to the Max prison, and we would meet with insider students. So men who have been convicted of some very, very horrible things.
Yes. And
I thought I had cracked it. It's all about family values. I got that. My guys were happy with that. And then I said, well, if we look at this parable as part of a triptych, so lost sheep, lost coin, 2 lost kids, and a lost dad, I said, I think it's all about counting. Why? Because the first parable begins, which person among you having 100 sheep? So it doesn't talk about a shepherd. There's no shepherd in the parable. It's not about a good shepherd. It's about a kind of dumb shepherd, because no shepherd's going to leave 99 sheep on the hillside. So now I know that the sheep owner isn't God, because God doesn't lose us, right? This is on the sheep owner. He lost the sheep. If the sheep had gone astray, you could make a case. So he loses the sheep. Well, how do you know you've lost a sheep? Which is a very practical question, because you can't tell sheep in a field to line up in groups of 10, because sheep can't count.
No, you certainly can't.
And you can't say, oh, it's the one with the beret or the one with the Vanderbilt t-shirt, because sheep don't accessorize. So you have to count them, which means you pass them through something called a sheepfold, and you count them.
Yes.
I have this image in the prophet Micah. Okay, so you know you've lost a sheep because you counted. So you find your sheep, and then you have this big celebration. And then there's this lady, or what woman having 10 silver coins upon losing one? This is on her, right? Sheep can go astray. Coins you lose, because coins don't walk off on their own, right? How does she know she's lost one of 10 coins? She has to count. And then the third parable begins, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the problem is he forgot to count. So he's got the one back, but there's still one son who was missing, because that son is not at home. The son is not at the dining room table. The son is not having the celebration. So he forgot to count. So I said to my guys, it's all about counting. And then one of my guys said to me, AJ, we are counted 6 times a day.
Whoa.
And then I went, oh, damn. So it's that other iteration. So when we count, we think we're taking account of someone. What does it mean when we feel like we're not being counted?
Yeah.
I mean, I know what that's like when I was junior faculty, this is, like years and years ago when Noah was still on the ark. I would say something and be ignored, and then some guy would say the same thing about 5 minutes later, and everybody goes, oh, what a great idea, right? Because we're not going to listen to the girl. I mean, so I know what it's like to be, discounted or ignored or having one's voice, but the idea is like you take roll. And in the classroom, like I know who's sitting there and I try to know the names of all my students. But how do I make sure that the student who's getting the high B and can't crack the A feels as counted as the A+ student who's acknowledged anyway, because it's the A+. Thank God you don't have to grade on a curve. Or the student who are the weaker students who are spending afternoons with me for special tutoring so I can get them through.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that everybody feels counted, including my guys? So it's not just taking a roll and checking off a name on the list, but paying attention to the special needs and the special concerns of everybody in the purview. And that's really hard.
Yeah.
But that's what the parable says. You can do that.
Yes.
Right? If God can pay attention to each one of us and number the hairs on our head, surely we can pay attention to who's in our classroom or who's in the church.
Yeah.
Or who's in the community.
Or who's in my family.
Or who's in the family.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, AJ, I so appreciate you being so generous with your time. There's hours and hours that we could spend talking about these parables, but I want to let churches and faith communities know they can engage more deeply with the story of the prodigal son or other biblical stories like it with the beginner's guides on Dr. Levine's work, which include videos and discussion prompts for classes and small group studies, and those are available from Abingdon Press. So please check those out.
That's correct. You can get Short Stories by Jesus. You can get the longer version with all the footnotes and the technical terms and more parables in the original volume that came out from HarperOne, or you can get the shorter version, which is the Bible study version from Abingdon. And if you want more parables, you can go to the more recent Jesus book called Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, where all the Christian doctrine stays in place. But let's look at what the Jesus stories tell us, whether parables or controversy stories about politics or economics, because a lot of the parables are economics, healthcare, family values, and so on. So there's a lot more to learn if we just put the text in their own historical context and read them as life-giving rather than as anti-Semitic pablum.
Yes, that would be good. It would be good if we did.
It would be a start.
It would be a good start. Dr. Amy Jill Levine is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace and a University Professor Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She was, as we said, the first Jewish scholar to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute, and her many, many wonderful, wonderful books include The Misunderstood Jew, The Bible with and Without Jesus, and, of course, Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi, which we've been talking about at great length today. And her most recent book, Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, was released by HarperOne in 2024. Please check out the Beginner's Guide on Dr. Levine's work on these parables and many others. Dr. Levine, I'm thrilled to get to talk to you. I just so appreciate the gift of this conversation and the gift of your time. Thanks for joining us on the program.
What a joy to talk with you. And what a joy to talk about this material.
That's going to just about wrap it up for this edition of Don't Encourage This. My thanks again to Dr. Amy Jill Levine for joining us. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this one, you can search up Don't Encourage This on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Player FM, an old-fashioned MP3 download onto your computer like our ancestors used to do. Or don't forget YouTube. If you'd like to say hello, drop us a line, won't you? At don'tencouragethis@gmail.com. From Oxford, Ohio, I'm Mark Von Bullock. That's all, folks.